There's about 320,000 churches in America that are not Catholic or Greek Orthodox. And so of those 320,000, only 5% are larger than 500. And then about 87% are less than 200. And so what we have to understand is the small church in America is the bread and butter of the church. It is what the church is made up of. It is the one that's connecting with the most people. And so at 95 Network, we have just really have a burning desire to come along beside those churches and help them to be healthy. And healthy for us doesn't necessarily mean that they're just growing numerically, but what we want to do is have them be both deep and wide. We want them to be healthy to where their ministries are strong, where they're impacting their community. But we also want to help them. I think if you study the Ephesians 4 model that Jesus gave us in verses 11 through 16, the last verse 16 says that it'll edify itself in love and it causes growth. And so at 95 Network, we really care about and want to support, be there for those small churches. If you think about it, Kevin, if there's 320,000 churches in America and there's 320 million people in America, every church in America would have to run 1,000 people to reach the country. So we got a lot of work to do.
Definitely got a lot of work to do. And it's amazing just kind of the influx. If you look at the churches that are these small churches, we were talking about a little bit before we jumped on about some of our background, and Dale, you had shared your growth strategy, being a small church pastor. And so I'd love for you to just kind of share a little bit about that before we jump in.
Well, just so I can relate to the folks who are tuning in with us, I pastored a small church for 12 years, and I tell everyone I grew it from 30 to 300 to 150 because in the 10-year mark, we had a really nasty split. And a lot of folks who are with us right now have probably experienced that. And the thing about that split that I have to own today, which I didn't own back then, was I think it was my fault. Because I had a situation with one of my leaders, one of my board members that I wouldn't confront. And I tell everybody I was a chicken. And because I kept pushing it away and wouldn't deal with it and hoped it would get better, it eventually blew up in my face. And so it was through that whole process that I learned it doesn't help you just to learn about leadership. At some point, you've got to implement what you're learning. And so that was a very difficult time for me. But so I've been in a small church. I know what it's like to be a lead pastor there. I've also served in every capacity that you can serve in pretty much in a church other than being a music pastor. So I can relate to the youth guy. I can relate to the discipleship person, to the outreach evangelism person. I even was a visitation pastor for a while. So been doing this for 37 years. And so hopefully you and I can share some things today with folks that'll keep them from going through some of the problems we went through.
Yeah, absolutely. I love getting to have these conversations just because they're so real and honest. And that's what we want to do here today. We don't want to just share a lot of content that's, we've done 1.5 million times before. We want to have a true conversation. And that's our goal with this today. So I'm going to start off just by talking about the unique situation that small churches find themselves in. And this is something that, we're talking about 95% of the churches here in America, but there really is a unique situation that these churches find themselves in. And it's always going to vary from church to church, but I want to share some of the things that I see from talking with the hundreds of churches that we get to interact with at TrainedUp. And one of the biggest things is I've been on a staff at a church this size. I served on staff as discipleship and creative pastor at a church of about 200 for a couple of years. We were a church replant, and it was probably the most trying time in my adult life. It was one of those times where there was some great growth. We had some fun. I had lots of opportunities to grow myself as a leader and in responsibilities and in my own character, but it was also the toughest time that I've ever lived in my adult life. We had lots of seasons where it was frustrations. There were staff infighting. There were things that we tried to do and initiatives that we tried to do that just didn't work. As a small group pastor, I was trying to launch our first section of small groups, and I had half the people show up to my first training meeting. It was those sorts of things that were just so frustrating. Every step forward that we tried to do, it felt like we were taking 3 steps back at the same time, and it felt like there was no way to move forward. And I'm sure that that's something that a lot of you listening to this webinar right now have experienced yourself, just because it's so difficult. I mean, when you're dealing with limited staff, when you're dealing with limited resources, limited budget, budget. It can feel like everything you do isn't going to have the impact that it's going to have. And so my experience at church this size, I remember one time I was preaching. I was scheduled to preach. Our lead pastor was out of town, and nothing went right that morning. There was no one at the door. All of our coffee makers went down, and you can't have church without coffee makers. Our
Absolutely.
person that was doing the offering went for 37 minutes. Like, no lie, they did an offering talk that was 37 minutes long, and I ended up having 14 minutes to preach at the end of the service time. I just had to go through my notes as quickly as possible. So it was like when you turn up that YouTube video or podcast video to 2 times speed. I was speaking like 3.5 times speed that day. One of the biggest things that I see, though, in the unique situation is what I like to call the man of God syndrome. And this is something that is relevant to all churches out there. And I talk about this in 2 different ways. There's the man of God syndrome that I talk about in larger churches where everything's about the pastor, and the pastor is the celebrity, and it's all about them. And when that celebrity pastor ends up leaving, there creates this void inside the church. Now, I want to preface that by saying, in the small church, it's completely different. There's still the man of God syndrome, but it's more of something that has to happen. It's out of a necessity than is more of a hindrance. And the man of God syndrome is you literally have to do everything in a small church. When you're dealing with limited budget, you're dealing with limited staff, there are so many things that are on your plate. If you were looking at some of the stuff that I was saying, there were 17,000 different things on your plate as a small church pastor. And that's something that all of us can relate with. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how to move beyond that. Because the man of God syndrome, you're going to get burnt out. If you got everything on your plate, you're trying to do it all yourself, you're going to burn out. You're not going to be healthy. You're going to have problems in your marriage. You're going to have problems in your church because you're not effectively dealing with all the things that you need to deal with. So Dale, I'd love for you to share some more about what that unique situation looks like and just your own experience and some of the churches that you've talked with.
Well, I think one of the first things you have to deal with is we have this problem in the church world where we compare ourselves to each other. And so we always think that, the grass is greener at the church down the street because they have a nicer sign or their grass is literally is kept better. But the reality is every church at different sizes, whether it's a church of 60, a church of 100, a church of 200, 500,000, whatever, they all have unique problems with their size. And they always have a next barrier to break. And so what happens to you when you get into this comparison mentality is you sell yourself short, I really believe is the biggest problem. So what one of the biggest things small churches find themselves dealing with is they have a lack of resources. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough people. Usually their facilities are not big enough. And so if you have a lack of resources, what it often does is it limits your vision. And the reason it limits your vision for the future, and we're going to talk more about vision in just a few minutes, is you tend to start focusing on your need or your lack instead of focusing on having faith that God puts you in that community for a purpose to accomplish something. If you really stop and think about it, biblically speaking, God is not motivated by our need. God is motivated by our faith. In fact, one of the last things Jesus said before he went back to heaven, just before the cross, was he said, I wonder, he said this, when the Son of Man returns to the earth, I wonder if I'll find faith. And what that simply means is as long as we're depending on ourselves and our abilities to accomplish God's work, we can never really do what we need to do. We've got to decide that we're serving the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the creator of the universe, the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And he has placed us where we are for such a time as this. And we've got to develop a level of faith. Now, I'm not talking about being presumptuous or being irresponsible. But if you can accomplish everything you're trying to do, then you're not living by faith. And so you've got to have an attitude of faith and a vision that stretches your faith. And instead of focusing on what you don't have, you've got to shift your thinking to start focusing on what you do have or what God's already given you to work with.
I think I'm going to go to church today and I'm going to get excited. If I start saying amen and shouting and pulling out my hanky, just know that I'm a Pentecostal. And so if any of those things happens, you guys are just going to have to deal with me a little bit.
Everybody knew you were Pentecostal when they saw your bald head and your big beard. So that worked out really good, man.
Well, I'm okay with that. As long as my beard doesn't start blowing in the wind or anything like that. Don't worry. I never pull out any snakes, especially on webinars, because I don't want anyone to run away.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So you're cool looking. If we move to the next level, one of the things I really want to make sure that we get embedded in everyone's thought is this: the foundational bedrock of all ministry focus has got to be vision. We're focusing today on volunteers and that kind of thing, but if you don't know your vision and literally and what your mission is, what you're trying to accomplish, and I realize every church's mission is pretty much the same. Jesus gave us that when he told us to go, the Great Commission, and we try to make it cooler and how we communicate it. But the reality is this: you can't develop a great volunteer culture if you have not defined why you exist. And what I want to ask you today is, okay, this coming Sunday, most of you are going to gather, and at 10 or 11 o'clock, whatever time you gather, you're going to have a worship service. My question is, do you know why you're having a worship service? Do you know why you exist? Some people say, well, it's because it's Sunday morning. That's not a mission. That you're just following culture. You need to understand you are a unique person. You are a unique leader. You're in a unique church, and God's put you in that community to make a difference. And so the bedrock to everything that we talk about when we work with churches is we actually travel with 95 Network to different areas of the country, and we do a one-day seminar, and we talk about 5 specific core growth engines, if you will. But the foundation, the bedrock of that is is your mission and your vision. If you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, if you don't understand that, then you can't build a volunteer culture. You can't build a discipleship path. You can't build a leadership culture. So you've really got to define that. And if you want to be a healthy church, you must understand that the vision and mission is key. And then you have to understand that, one pastor, one leader can only lead about 75 people. Some guys have the capacity maybe to lead 100. But the reason so many small churches stay small is because they don't have a leadership culture. And if you don't have a leadership culture, it's very difficult to create a volunteer culture.
Absolutely. I always hear that statistic that, you can lead 75 to 100 people. And at first, I remember the first time I heard that, I was like, well, that sounds like a stupid statistic. If I can only lead 100 people, how am I ever going to grow? Because I get to 150 and I don't, have the money to hire another staff person. Are we going to go back down to 100? And so I'd love for you to kind of touch on that a little bit more, Dale, to talk about what that means. Because when I'm hearing that, I can lead 75 or 100 people and I need a leadership culture, what does that even mean?
Well, think about this. Everyone has some level of giftedness as a leader. One of the questions that's always asked is, well, are leaders born? Well, obviously, we're all born, but there are some people who have a gift. Romans 12 talks about a gift of leadership, and there are some people who have that. But everybody has the capacity to lead at some level. If you think about the story where Moses was leading the people, and his father-in-law came to him and said, look, Moses, what you're doing is not good. You can't accomplish what you're going to wear yourself out. You're not going to accomplish any kind of effectiveness. You've got to begin to hand this thing off, and you have to pick people. And those people may have an ability to lead 10. They may have the ability to lead 50, 100, 500, 1,000, whatever. You have levels of leadership within your congregation. Now, here's the thing that's very important to understand. Let's just say, Kevin, that just on a scale of 1 to 10, and John Maxwell taught us this years ago, if I'm a 4, if my leadership ability is a 4, then I'm going to attract people who are 4 and under in their leadership ability. So if someone has the leadership ability of 8, unless I have make room to allow them to help me lead the organization, they probably aren't going to stick it out. And so here's the thing. If you're capable of leading 75 to 100 people and you want to grow your church, the only natural thing you can do is you've got to begin to raise up and develop leaders. One of the cool things that happened in my church that I shared with you about that I pastored for many, many years, half the people who attended our church were people we'd won to Jesus. Now, those are great days when you're discipling, mentoring, modeling for people who did not know the Lord. It's much more difficult to lead people who've got it all figured out, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And so the next thing you have to do, if you're going to really develop this healthy ratio and systems and having a healthy church, the next thing you have to do is what I call the big 3 of leading volunteers. With all volunteers in any position in the church, this is something that I just think I've seen it work, I've implemented it, and this works. There are 3 things that I think you have to do to lead volunteers. The first thing you have to do is you have to have a written job description. And what I mean by that is if you have guys who work the parking lot, even if it's just a couple of sentences, write down what you're expecting them to do in the parking lot. And that may sound really silly to you, but I can tell you of experiences where I've gone and worked with churches to where the parking lot guys are out talking about the score of a football game, and I'm out trying to, as a secret shopper, I'm actually pulling on handles of cars, trying to break in the cars, and they won't even stop me because they're too busy. So they didn't know what the expectations were. So you have to have a written job description, and what that does is it creates accountability. So if I was going to hire you, Kevin, let's say I was going to hire you to be my youth pastor. What I would do is this. I would say, look,
fail if that was the case.
Well, and we would find that out in this process, because here's what I do. I say, all right, Kevin, I want you to write down what you envision that role to be as youth pastor. And then I'm going to write down what I believe it needs to be. And then we're going to share those things in writing with what we believe. And then we're going to come up together with a thoroughly written down vision of what the expectations are. Here's what happens every Monday morning in churches all across America and in communities. Youth pastors are in trouble with the pastor, with the board, and they don't know it because no one's ever told them the expectations. So if you're going to have a great volunteer culture, whether it's people who are serving in your nursery, your children's ministry, your ushers, your greeters, any area, take the time to write down what the expectations are. The second thing you have to do as a leader is you have to provide them the resources or the tools they need for success. If I hire you to be my youth pastor, but I don't give you any budget to work with, if I don't have a place that you guys can meet, if I'm not willing to resource what you need and help you provide the materials, curriculum, if you will, then I've set you up for failure. So the first two things as a leader that I want to do in a volunteer culture is I want to get a written job description and I want to resource the people. But here's the third thing, and it's required of the person that was the volunteer. They have to have a good attitude. If they don't have a good attitude, you first of all try to meet with them to help resolve that. But here's what I want you to know. If you allow a bad attitude to exist within your congregation or in an area of your ministry, they will spoil that entire thing. And especially in a small church, we are unwilling most of the time to set the bar high because we're scared we're going to run everybody off because we don't have enough people. But here's what I have observed. If you'll set the bar high, what you'll find is the cream will rise to the top. And so as you put these things in place, it helps you to develop the proper volunteer culture to where you don't just have people doing things, you have the right people doing things.
Absolutely. We talk about that a lot at TrainedUp, and we even have a resource on our blog about how to let someone go as a volunteer and how to talk with someone that maybe isn't doing some of those things correctly. And attitude is probably the number one thing that churches and volunteer teams struggle with, because you can have someone in there that's just a detractor. We call them detractors because they detract from everything else. No matter what you're doing positively, no matter what positive things are happening in your ministry, if you have those detractors, it's going to be difficult to do anything. It's going to be difficult to lay out mission. It's going to be difficult to lay out your vision. It's going to be difficult to try and change anything in the ministry or take any steps forward, because you're always going to have those negative people that are going to detract from what you're doing with those bad attitudes.
Kevin, I was just on a call an hour ago I have a pastor that I'm coaching. And as I was talking to this pastor, they're having an issue right now where there's a member of the church that's caused a lot of problems, that's tried to divide the church and destroy the church. And for pastors, a lot of pastors, you struggle with this because you think, well, I'm a shepherd. I'm there to take care of the sheep. Well, here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes the people with bad attitudes are not sheep. Sometimes they're wolves. And as a shepherd, your job is to run the wolves off, or at least keep the wolves away from the sheep. Now, I'm not saying you have to run everybody off that has the bad attitude. I think the first thing you do is you sit down with them. You try to understand. Maybe you're not communicating effectively, or maybe they've been hurt in the past, or maybe they don't trust you. But there are some times as a leader where you've just got to stand up and say, you know what, this is just not working. We're not going to tolerate your attitude, because if you don't deal with that, then what's going to happen is here's one of my favorite things that I've learned to say. You will perpetuate what you tolerate. In other words, you're going to keep going and it's going to grow in your church what you allow. So after a point of time, let's just say you have someone in your children's ministry with a really bad attitude. After a period of time, your congregation is not going to blame your children's pastor for that person. They're going to blame you, because you don't have the atmosphere in place to deal with that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to move on just a little bit, just for the sake of time, for us to talk about volunteer recruiting and churn a little bit. And this is something that we really want to talk about here in small churches, just because it feels like one of the most difficult things to do. And a lot of it has to do with something you said previously about mission and vision and not establishing that and not perpetuating it. And that's always the number one step that we talk about. If you look at any of our guides on TrainedUp about how to do training in whatever area it is, we always talk about that mission and vision as that first step. But there are so many other little things that we can talk about here. So Dale, I'd love for you to just kind of take over a little bit and talk about some things that we can do inside of our churches to do these things better.
I have two things I really want to focus on. The first one is this, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier as far as not looking at your need. You need to take an inventory of what you actually have in the house. If you remember the story in the Bible where where Elisha went to the little widow and said, "Would you make me something to eat?" And she said, "Oh, I don't have anything in the house but a little oil." And so he told her, said, "Go get a bunch of vessels." And you know the story, how she got vessels, and the oil kept flowing as long as she created vessels. What he needed to accomplish, and what she needed to accomplish was already in the house. And there are people in your church, especially, this goes back to your, how did you say what was your big man syndrome? What was the syndrome you called it?
The man of God syndrome.
The man of God syndrome. What happens a lot of times in small churches is we feel like we have to do everything. And so there are people in our church that have gifts, that have abilities, who want to serve. And sometimes it'll blow your mind. I was on staff at a church recently as an executive pastor, and we were really struggling raising up someone to lead our security team. And this guy named Terry was in our church. And if you met Terry, the last thing you would think when you first met Terry was that Terry was a great leader. But as things happened and we connected, we let Terry begin to lead that ministry. And man, he took off and ran with that thing. And it is really one of the best run areas of that church, where we found someone in the house who had the ability to lead, but you've got to give them the ability. And again, it goes right back to what we said earlier. You have to define your expectations, and you have to sit down and make sure they've got the things they need to do that. And then this next point is huge. When you recruit volunteers, you've got to give them an end date for service. I shared this with a group of pastors recently, and they all stood up and started shouting, because here's what I'm talking about. Let's say you're in a small church and you're recruiting people to serve in the nursery. If you don't make that semester oriented, where you say, okay, we need someone to serve in the fall, someone in the spring, and then someone in the summer, and you always have a chance to opt out at the end, then they feel like it's a life sentence. And no one wants to serve in ministry where they feel like there's no end date or it's a life sentence. Specifically, if I'm going to serve in areas that require a lot of stress, if you will. Children's ministry creates a lot of stress. So you've got to provide end dates. And so what we like to do is say, hey, let's create those end dates based on the school year. So, you do the fall semester, the spring semester, and then the summer. And those two things I think are very important when you're dealing with recruiting and churn, especially when most the turnover is pretty quick.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we do in our ministry at small groups at my church. Is we have all of our small group leaders sign a year-long commitment. So we actually have a covenant that we have people read over, pray over, to really think through before committing to it, and then give them that out date of saying, hey, serve for these 9 months. If after that, you don't want to serve anymore, that's completely fine. And going along with that, one of the biggest things that I see is we don't account for churn. And churn's just the idea that people are going to turn over time. So most ministries, most ministry leaders, most pastors just look at what they have currently right now. So if you have a need of 10 volunteers in your kids ministry, that's all you think about. You're like, okay, I need to fill these 10 positions, and I'll have them, for the next year. If we talk about the semester-based or those period-based ideas, we'll have these 10 for that amount of time. And then, of course, all of them are going to re-up, right? We all know that everyone that serves with us, none of them ever turn over, and we always get to serve with the same people over and over again. That's been your experience, right?
Well, here's the thing, Kevin. People have got to understand that, and I love to say it this way. I said, there's this book called the Bible. There's this guy named Jesus. He started this thing called the church, and in Ephesians 4, he told us exactly how he wanted it to run. And he said this: he put these ministry gifts, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. He put those in the church, and he said this is what they're for: to equip saints to do ministry. And so if we don't have an equipping environment, if we don't create a leadership environment, we won't have the volunteers we need because we do everything. So we've got to learn how to become equipping leaders so that the people in our church can fulfill their giftedness. And sometimes people come in packages that you just are surprised of their giftedness. You've got to create an avenue so you can find out what people are gifted at and what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the general rule of thumb is you should count on at least 10% turnover every 6 months or every semester that you have. And that's just a general rule. 10% of the people that you have serving at least are going to move on to something else. It could be for family reasons. It could be that they just have too many things on their plate. It could just be that they're not a good fit for the ministry, but you should always count on at least 10% turnover every single time you end up serving and have these semester-based approaches. And that leads to the next problem is if we're going to have a 10% turnover and we know that, we can plan for that, that means that we always have to be recruiting inside of our churches, inside of our ministries. And typically this isn't something that happens in small churches. We typically have those 2 weeks before the semester starts and we're trying to get everyone on board and we kind of are frantic at that point where we're reaching out to the person that's running our social media and we're asking them to post 37 different times about needing volunteers for this area. And surprisingly, we almost never get the amount of people that we need because we wait for that last minute approach to it. And that's a big problem. So the biggest thing that I can see in churches of a great way to do this, and this is something that we've adopted in our church, is honoring your volunteers. If you create a culture of honor in your church, people will be more likely to want to volunteer. And the great thing about that is once they see that this isn't just a task for them to do, it isn't just something that they have to check off over and over again, that they're going to be serving in the back room, that no one's ever going to acknowledge them, no one's ever going to see the work that they're doing. That's how people typically think about volunteers in the church, is that I'm going to be overworked and underappreciated. And that's something that you have to do as a ministry leader to make sure that people see that that's not the case in your church. And this is a small step that you can do of just simply handing out thank you cards, having a team of the month that you honor in your church, or having a volunteer of the month that you honor inside of your church, and just simply write them a handwritten thank you card. You don't need to give them a big gift if you don't have the budget for it, or you can just give them a $10 gift card for one volunteer every month.
Absolutely.
$120 in your budget a year that surely you can find somewhere. I mean, don't budget something in the budget to make that happen. And it makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
In the morale of your teams.
Hey, and you said 4 times as you set that up, you used the word need. And you said you talked about how a lot of churches wait till 2 weeks before something. So one of the keys in mission and vision is you've got to sit down. If you have a true mission and vision, you must sit down and plan out your yearly calendar. You've got to know what's coming when it's coming and communicate that way ahead and think through what's coming so that you're not you just can't lead your ministry if you're motivated by need. It's got to be motivated by mission and vision. And I just thought that was cool that as you set that up, you said the word need like 4 times. You can't lead people out of panic. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. And no one wants to buy into that. I mean, if you're panicking and I see that everything's in chaos and you're desperate for volunteers, what kind of mindset is that creating in your volunteer? Like, who is the crazy person that's going to say yes to that? Like, because if the crazy person's going to say yes to that, you may not want them on your team in the first place because they're probably not the right fit.
Again, it just says that you don't have a clear mission and vision. If you're just waiting till something happens, if you're always putting out fires, at some point you've got to become proactive to what God raised you up to do in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about training and development.
Okay.
We just have a few minutes left. I just want to briefly touch on this, of something that we've seen inside of churches, and highlight a couple things that we have, and then we'll jump into Q&A after that. So if you guys have questions that you want Dale and myself to answer, go ahead and start sending those in now, and we'll review them and be able to provide you some answers to that. So this is your chance to get some free coaching from us, to get some free consulting, and ask whatever you want. So take advantage of this time. But I wanted to highlight just a couple things that we've noticed. And one of the great things that I love about TrainedUp and the 9-5 Network is that we get to work with churches from all over. We get to work with churches from all backgrounds, and we get to see what works and what doesn't work inside of churches. And what I love is it always seems like a pastor is alone in it. And this is something that I hear over and over again, like I see this ministry being so successful and we're trying to do stuff and we're just not seeing any fruit in it. We've tried to train our volunteers. We've tried to recruit people. We've done all these things, but we're not seeing fruit in it. And one of the biggest things with training and development is before you can start raising up leaders is you have to believe your own mission and vision. Not only do you have to have that mission and vision in writing and you have to portray that to the people that you're leading, but before you can train up people, before you can raise up people to serve inside your ministry, is you have to be living it out yourself. You have to believe that wholeheartedly and you have to personify that mission and vision. And once you do that, then it becomes much easier to start training people. It becomes much easier to start developing people. And the cornerstone of training and development is that mission and vision. It's not, these are the tasks that you need to do. It's getting people excited for the work that they're doing and the reason why they're doing it. Because if people are excited about the work, they're more likely to stick around. They're more likely to be effective. They're going to be great volunteers, and they're going to even do the recruiting for you because they're going to get excited about what they're doing. They're going to ask their friends to start serving. They're going to find other people to start serving with you. And this is something that just can't be done in a once a year, 60-minute meeting. This is something that, you have to be doing at all times. You have to be recruiting at all times. You have to be talking about your mission and vision at all times. And you have to be training at all times. Because let's face it, if we're small church pastors, we don't have the time to do a training meeting every single month. And that's the whole reason that TrainedUp exists. We found that on average, about 50% of people show up to a training meeting anyway. And usually it's those people that don't even need the training in the first place. Those are our people that are already bought into it. And we're just preaching to the choir at our training meetings. That's why we developed TrainedUp, is so that you as a small church pastor, you as a medium-sized church pastor can go out there and focus on the ministry. You can focus on development. You can focus on raising other people up. And then you can outsource the things that you need to outsource and be able to focus on the things that you do well.
I've had the opportunity for the last few years to serve with the Unstuck group. And so we help churches through doing a process to help them with the strategic planning process. And one of the things that you have to help a church to understand is, especially in a small church, there's probably 25 things that you want to fix in your church. You can't fix 25 things. We spend a couple of days together and we help the church to define what are the one or two, three things that you can do today that'll bring you the highest return. We call it low-hanging fruit, or what's the win? Where do you get the quickest win? And so for everything you just set up, Kevin, the thing I want people to understand is you got to do things incrementally. You can't just, first of all, you'll overwhelm your people if you try to do too much too quick. It's better to do two things very well or one thing very well and become really solid at it than attempt to do 10 things and not follow through with any of it. So it's very important that you break that down. And one of the cool things we have in our content side at 95 Network is we actually have a course that's been made available to us through Tony Morgan from the Unstuck group, and it's called Leading an Unstuck Church. And basically, there's 12 lessons he teaches. Actually, there's a hidden bonus lesson. But there's these 12 lessons. And basically, you can take your church and work through this course once a month, where you as the leader, you go through it, and then you meet with your team. You lead them through it. And here's what I love about it, Kevin. The 12 points that he covers, the 12 issues he deals with, are basically what we've discovered in working with over 300 churches in the last few years that seem to be the consistent same issues that happen over and over and over again. And this is true in a church of 60, and this is in a church of 600, and this is true in a church of 6,000. The same kind of issues keep arising. And number one is mission vision, and then leadership development, and developing a discipleship pathway, how to create a volunteer culture, communications, and it goes on and on and on. And so it's very important that you take advantage of things like we have at TrainedUp, and is what we have at 95 Network. These things are not just things we pulled out of the air. They come from research, and there are things, if you'll implement them, you'll see your church begin to become stable and grow and develop that growing atmosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And if that's something you guys are interested in, head over to 95 Network or to TrainedUp and have a conversation with our teams there. We'll send out some information about it after the fact to you guys that have attended this webinar. But it's just something we want to put out there for you guys. There's obviously no obligation to that. And we don't want to sell you on something. We just want to help you. We're trying to help you do ministry. And the thing that I love about what we're doing at TrainedUp and what Dale and the team are doing at 95 Network is we're always going to give you our best content. We're not going to charge you for it. We're going to tell you as it is. We're going to give you as much as we can. We're going to help coach you and consult with you, and we're going to give away our best information for free, because that's what we want to do. Our job is to resource the local church, and we take that seriously. But I want to go into some Q&A here. And so the first question that I see come through is, where should a pastor of a small church start? And I'd love for you to take this one, Dale.
Do you know specifically what it means, where to start?
Just where to start at with all that we're talking about here with volunteer training and development.
The most important thing goes back to what we've said all day. You've got to discover why you exist. You can't do any of the other things that we've discussed today successfully if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. Again, I know so many churches, it's 11 o'clock or it's 10 o'clock on Sunday, so that's why we have church. Yeah, but what are you trying to accomplish that day? Well, we're just doing what we've always done. That's not a mission or vision. So in your town, and if you're a pastor who is pastoring a church of 30 or 300, you need to know, why did God raise you up in that town, and what is it specific? And look, if there may be 3 churches of the same denomination within 2 miles of each other, and I still believe each one has something individual about that church. So that's the first place you start, is you've got to nail down why you exist, what your mission and vision is, and then we begin to build on top of that, because here's what happens. It becomes your filter. See, when you begin to get momentum, Kevin, all of a sudden when you get momentum, everybody has all these ideas for you. So I used to tell the folks at my small church when I pastored it, I would say, listen, if you come to me with the problem, you have to come to me with the solution. If I don't need help pointing out the problems, I know the problems. You've got to be able to come to me with a solution, and you need to be willing to do it, because you can't come to me and tell me everything God told you to tell me to do. I've got enough on my plate. Right. So you need to be able to help develop the solutions to go with the problems. But if that mission vision becomes a filter to where if someone comes up with an idea of something they want to do, but it really doesn't fit your mission and vision, you're not saying that that's a bad idea. You're just, it gives you a filter to say, for now, that's not something we want to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. And going along with that, once you have that mission and vision established, there are a couple of things that we mentioned a little bit before, as Dale was talking earlier, is look for those small wins. What are the things that you can do right now to get something off your plate? If you're not great at making coffee, you probably shouldn't, lead the coffee team. Like, if there is something small that you can get off your plate, get it off your plate, and don't guard everything so closely. Be willing to give something up and give freedom for someone to run that department or that ministry area the way that they see fit, as long as it relates well back to your church.
You got to let me jump in right here. This is awesome. So Andy Stanley, a lot of us understand what a great communicator, leader Andy Stanley is. And Andy Stanley tells a story that when he first started North Point, that he was trying to help lead events. He said the problem is he's terrible at events. So his staff actually met with him and fired him out of events and said, Andy, you're the communicator. And here's a mistake we make in small churches. And again, I understand you feel like you have to do everything. Here's what we do. The thing that we do well is the thing we neglect. The thing that we're gifted at, whether it's leading or preaching, we say, well, I've got that down. So we try to put a lot of energy and again, I'll use the scale of 1 to 10. Let's just say that I'm a 2 in planning events. And we think if I work really hard, I can become a 3 at doing events. You're still not helping your church. So instead of working on doing what you don't do well, work on what you do well and make it better, and hand over what you need to get done through other people. And again, small churches, you don't have that many people to draw from. But I believe if your mission and vision is clearly defined, you will raise up the people who will help you fulfill that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question that came through from Jackie, and her question is, any specific plans, tips on recruiting through personal asking relationships? For instance, do you have experience within small groups where there is a focus on people's gifts and how they can be connected and serving? And I love to just jump in here just for a second here. And I believe this is the most effective way at recruiting new people inside of your church, is through personal relationships and just asking them to serve. And one of the biggest things that I see in this, that I've experienced, small groups is my area that I love. Discipleship is where I've served on staff at churches. It's the area that I love most inside of the church, and where I plan on serving for the rest of my life. But in this specific area inside of small groups, is the number one thing that I see is I can see something in a person that they're ready to serve, but they haven't seen to themselves yet. And it requires some coaching. It requires some conversations. And the biggest mistake that I see small group pastors and small group leaders making in this area is they ask someone one time, hey, would you be interested in leading a small group? And then that person says, no, that's not really something that I want to do. And we try and maybe convince them on the spot. And then that's the end of the conversation. When in reality, we need to put in practice a little bit of coaching there, meet with them one-on-one, have conversations with them, tell them why you think they would be a great small group leader, and be like, hey, these are the things that I see in you. There are some things that you definitely need to work on. I'm not saying that you're perfect. I'm not saying that I'm perfect. There are things that we all need to work on, but I think you can be a great small group leader here if you'll put in, 6 months, if you'll try it out. And that's something that I've seen be really effective.
Hey, Kevin, I want to give everybody a free gift today. You just made me think of it. So I'm giving this free gift to everyone who's participating today. I'm giving you the gift to fail. It's okay to try things that don't work. It's okay to recruit people and try to plug them in areas and finally come back and say, you know what, that's really not a good fit for them. It's okay. Now, here's the thing I want you to understand. If you have people that have been in your church for years and years and years and they're not involved, the odds are they're not going to get involved. What you need to do is take advantage of, and Kevin was highlighting this, the new people. At the church that I just previously worked at, one of the things we did was we actually had every area of ministry at our new members class. We did a new members class and we let them know, here are areas you can sign up, and we signed them up on the spot. We got them plugged in and we did the follow-up immediately. You must take advantage of the moment and take advantage of the momentum when you get new people who want to be involved in your church. Those who've been there with you for years, typically they're just along for the ride. But if you want to get people plugged in and create some fresh blood, then what you've got to do is make sure you get those new people implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got one more question, and it's from a guy I've never heard of before. His name's Scott from TrainedUp, so I have no clue who that guy could be. But he wants to ask, what traits do you look for in potential volunteer leaders to lead teams? I'd love for you to take this one real quick, Dale.
2 Timothy 2:2. The Bible says, Paul's talking to Timothy, and he says, "In the things that you've seen in me among many witnesses, I want you to commit to faithful people who are able also." In the church world, we always bless and highlight faithfulness, but we don't highlight ability. And so to give you a great example, if you have someone leading worship who can't sing, and the reason you have them leading worship is because over the last 20 years, they've been faithful. The problem is you're going to run away anybody who has an ear. You're not going to have musicians in your church. So the most important thing you can understand about recruiting volunteers is you have to get people who are faithful, but they also have ability. They've got to have ability to do what you're asking them to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of those things can be taught, they can be trained up, but you have to be willing to be able to put in that work as well. Obviously, if someone can't sing, you probably shouldn't have them leading worship. Even if they want to, maybe we have them running sound.
Hey, Kevin, you and I both know we've been in settings where people, it's just like, well, how did that person get in any specific place of ministry? I've heard stories about people who've been church treasurers for 30 years who don't give to the church. So you have a church treasurer who doesn't even tithe, and his comment is, "Well, I don't want to give money. I just want to find out what everybody else gives." That guy can't be your treasurer. You've got to get people who are faithful, but who also have ability. And so we've all experienced the devastation of sitting in a service where someone wasn't able to do what they were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's going to be it for today's webinar. I hope you guys enjoyed this and this was helpful for your ministry. If you have any questions about this, if you want to follow up, you have questions about something you heard today, or you just want more information, or if you have a question that you didn't want to ask in front of everyone, feel free to head over to TrainedUp. We have live chat on our website. Our entire team will be there all day, and we'd love to have that conversation with you and answer any questions that you have. And I want to say thank you to Dale for joining us on this webinar. We'll be sending